Hello, and in this Mac/iOS development tutorial, I'm going to talk to you about the different classes of variables, or the different modifiers for variables that you have available to you in Swift. So, in Swift we have something called a computed variable, a regular stored variable, and a lazy stored variable. This is a distinction that is actually pretty simple, but it took me a while to get my head around it, and the documentation goes through these different types of variables, but the computed variables and lazy stored variables actually behave in a very similar way sometimes, and the documentation doesn't explicitly kind of acknowledge that they might be similar and specifically delineate what the difference is, so I thought I would do that in this video. So a computed variable in Swift is a variable that is its value is worked out and computed and returned every time the variable is called. So when you define the variable, it doesn't do anything. It's basically a function that when you call it, it gets whatever other variables it requires for its computation, gets their current values, and then works out its computation from that. A lazy stored variable is a variable that gets its values at the first time it's used, but then doesn't get them again unless you change it. It just keeps the value that it's had the first time. That's compared to a standard variable that's its values are given when you initialize it. So that's the difference. A lazy variable is lazily instantiated, as in it only bothers to get a value when it's first used, and a computed variable only gets a value when it's first used, but it rechecks the value and recalculates the value every time it's used. So that's the difference. We're gonna look at some a just simple real world example now, but that's the difference. So when would you want a lazy variable rather than a variable that's computed when you first start your application or get into that method? Well, you'd want a lazy variable when either the computation of that variable is very intensive, so you don't want to start it until it's necessary, or you, as we see in this example, where the variables that you want to the way you want to calculate your variable won't in itself be set by the time you want to call that variable. So without further ado, let's take a look at some simple examples. So I've got an Xcode window open here that all it does is creates as a class which is a view controller, and it sets up a few simple variables. A standard variable which just gets the view of the view controller, gets its width and divides it by 2, and then a half-width lazy variable which we notice is lazily instantiated, so it only gets called when we first call it, and then which just again calculates the same value. And then we've got a computed variable which, notice, has to be explicitly typed and is like a function. It returns returns a value, but it returns the same value. And then when we press a button, we're just printing the values of these variables. So this is the point at which we ask for those variables. So if we run our application, we see that first off we get an error. Why is that? Well, it's by design. I intended for that to happen. Why does this half-width variable not work? Well, this variable is created even if you use it later. Regular variables are created when the parent object is initialized, when this class is initialized, but it doesn't, when this class is initialized, it doesn't know the view that it's going to be controlling yet, so the self.view isn't going to work, and you get a strange error message. But if you get this error message, it's basically saying I can't use myself before it exists. So we know in this case we have to use either a lazily instantiated variable or a computed variable, and in simple cases they can look quite similar, but in this case we're going to explicitly look at the difference. So obviously we're accessing the view here, which has a size, and we're getting the width, and each time we press a button, we're gonna print out the width and print out both the lazy and the computed width. Let's now rerun this and see what happens. Let's click the button. To start off with, these two are going to compute the same value. Why is that? Well, this is the first time we've used the variable, and nothing's changed out of the size of the view. So the lazy variable sets itself the first time you use it, and the computed variable sets itself every time. But that's the first time we use both of them, so there's no difference. Let's look at what happens to the computed variable when we change the size of the window, which is going to change the size of this view. The value of the lazy variable, if you notice, stays the same because it was only calculated the first time it was called, but the value of the computed variable has changed, updated to reflect the different size in the view. So the key thing to remember here is that a computed variable is computed every time it's accessed. No matter what you do, there's no storage in a computed variable. It's computed every time, and a lazy variable stores the value until you change it, but the value is only stored and calculated the first time it's used. So what does this mean kind of in terms of your applications? Well, it's a good way to get around things when they're not initialized yet, and you need to access their properties, because by the time you're using them later, you know that they will be initialized. But in terms of the difference between them, you want to try to use a lazy variable whenever possible, because a computed variable and something like this, the values are unpredictable, because they can be computed differently every time, and a computed variable is also more intense because a lazy variable is computed the first time and then it's stored, but a computed variable is stored every time. So that's a basic delineation of the difference. Hadn't seen any of those on YouTube, and it's not very clear in Apple's documentation, so just thought I'd explain that quickly. Anyway, thanks very much for watching this video, and I hope it was helpful. Bye bye.